Hi, Cullen.
Hello, Bob. How are you?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
Just fine, thanks.
Excellent. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright of Blogging Heads TV. You are Cullen Murphy of Vanity Fair, but more to the point, you're the author of several books, including the brand new book about the Inquisition called God's Jury. You know, I wouldn't have thought that I'd ever hear myself saying I've been reading a delightful book about the Inquisition, but this is a delightful book, Cullen.
Well, thank you very much.
And it's also more relevant than one might imagine to the contemporary world, I would say. And what I'd like to do is divide the conversation into two halves. Talk, first of all, about the historical part, the Inquisition itself, because I think there are a lot of things that people don't know or understand about the Inquisition. Certainly that turned out to be the case with me. And then second, you know, after that I wanted to talk about the legacy of the Inquisition and its relevance in various ways to the modern world. Is that a reasonable way to proceed?
It makes perfect sense.
Okay. But before we do that, just to get a glimpse of the kind of thing that we'll be talking about in the second half, could you talk a little about what you mean by the subtitle, which is The Inquisition and the Making of the Modern World? What kinds of connections to the modern world did you have in mind?
Sure. We can come back to what immediately precipitated my looking into this topic.
Mm-hmm.
But after I began looking into the topic, it began to occur to me that there was a larger reality here that we ought to pay attention to, and it was simply this. You know, we hear about the Inquisition. It's a word that everybody knows, and everybody is familiar with, you know, bits of Inquisition kitsch. You know, whether it's Monty Python and No One Expects the Spanish Inquisition, or Inquisition techniques, and so on and so forth. And the aura around the Inquisition is that it's a kind of medieval institution, and it began to dawn on me that that's actually the wrong way to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
That really, when you begin to understand how an institution like this is built and sustained, that it really comes across as a very early modern institution.
Mm-hmm.
That if you look at the Inquisition in the right way, you begin to see these glimmerings of the world becoming the world that we live in now.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was, as the book evolved, a large part of the motivation was to try to explain why we should think about the Inquisition as one of the first modern institutions, because it has so much modern DNA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was surprised to find out how much institutional continuity there was with the Inquisition within the Church. So Pope Benedict, back when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, headed something called the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, right? And in the earlier part of the 20th century, that had been called the Sacred Congregation of the Holy Office, and until 1908, that had been called the Sacred Congregation of the Universal Inquisition, right?
Yeah, it sometimes takes the Vatican a little while to get the message that something is not going down very well, and the Inquisition lasted institutionally until 1908,
mm-hmm.
and so then at that point, 1908 was not exactly a high point even then of liberal thinking in the Church, but they decided this name was not really doing the Church any good, so they changed it to the Holy Office. But it really was, in many respects, a name change. The bureaucratic apparatus was, in many ways, the same. It was like reorganizing your office and giving yourself, you know, a euphemistic new name. Mm-hmm. And one astonishing thing was that the headquarters of the Inquisition, which was it's actually a beautiful building, right inside the Vatican. It was built in the 16th century, just when the Roman Inquisition was getting underway, and so that building, a place that Galileo would have known and Giordano Bruno would have known, that building was still the headquarters of the successor entities in the Vatican. And in fact, Cardinal Ratzinger's office was in that building.
And there's, at some level of abstraction, there's some commonality in between his mission when he had that job and the mission of the Inquisition per se, right? I mean, obviously the techniques have changed, but I mean, is there some substantive continuity in that sense?
Sure. It's not an accident that Cardinal Ratzinger was called the Grand Inquisitor. In fact, one of the New York cardinals introduced him that way from the pulpit, and I'm not sure it got a belly laugh from Ratzinger, but
I'm not sure anything ever has, but
but yes, institutionally it does some of the same kind of work that the Inquisition did, which is mainly enforcement, doctrinal enforcement, making sure people are thinking correct thoughts. The big difference is that the Church doesn't have the kind of power it used to have to do certain things to people. Back in the 16th century, it had physical territory. It had the Papal States. People within its borders were really subject to its control, as any state would have people under its control. And earlier than that, the Church had alliances with secular powers and magnates and feudal lords and so on, who could also be relied on to do its business, to apprehend people and punish them. And in the 20th century, it doesn't really have that power, but it does have some residual power over people who are affiliated with the Church and who are in Church institutions. And so it's kind of ironic that the only people it has power over right now are the people who want to be loyal to the Church. And those are the people it can reach by denying jobs or denying preferment and titles. But anybody who wants to walk away, the Church has no power over them whatsoever.
That is an important change. Okay, so before we get back to the history and the origins of the Inquisition and the phases it went through, do you want to say something about how you got interested in this?
Yeah, I actually would like to, and it relates exactly to what we were just talking about. I've covered religion as a subject for much of my career, one way or another, and I am a Catholic, and so over the years I've come into contact with people, some of them very well known, some of them not very well known at all, who've had run-ins with the Vatican, and these are not mere slaps on the wrist or we'd rather you didn't sort of run-ins, but career altering run-ins, and I'm thinking on the order of 10 or 12 such people.
Really?
And, yeah, and some of them are people who I've been writing about. Some of them are friends, and so it was a conversation with one of them when I first learned the, to me, still astonishing fact that Ratzinger's old office, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, was still in the same palazzo that the Inquisition was in, and so it prompted me to explore the nature of the continuity, which is considerable.
Can you give us an example of these people you've known? What is an example of an infringement that one of them has committed that led them to get slapped on the wrists or led their career to get redirected?
Well, someone like Hans Kung, to take a very famous example, he is dissented from church doctrine as defined by Rome in any number of ways, and he has questioned, among other things, papal authority. There's nothing like questioning papal authority to get
No,
papal authority.
I'm told that papal authorities have a differing view of papal authority than
yes,
that.
they
Yeah.
do, and so he was subject to a great deal of questioning, and he got away with it for some period of time, but eventually the boom was lowered, and this being it was then the 20th century, the boom took the form not of some of the physical forms it might have taken centuries earlier, but he lost the right to teach as a Catholic theologian at the University of Tübingen. So that kind of control over a job at the Catholic professoriate is an example of the kind of sway that the church still has, and that's a fairly typical example. You're denied the right to teach as a Catholic theologian. You may find a job elsewhere at the university, as Hans Kung did and others have done elsewhere.
Okay.
You might have to move. Sometimes you're silenced. If you're loyal to the church or regard yourself as being loyal, and they decide that it really is not a good idea for you to be talking out loud. They may say you can't. Or they may, as they did in one case, assign you a censor, a kind of a personal trainer for the mind.
I could use one of those. I would have gotten into a lot less trouble over the years if I had somebody dedicated to that mission.
Yes, we've been urging one on you for years, but to no avail.
So you got interested in this, and I don't know what first surprised you. I was, in reading the book, I was surprised to learn, first of all, that there were actually several different Inquisitions. I think most people think of the Spanish Inquisition when they think of the Inquisition. But it goes back earlier than that. It starts in the 13th century, I guess, under Pope Gregory the Ninth. And I guess it's a tribute to the success of the early Inquisition that the initial targets of the Inquisition were people I have not heard of, right? I mean, apparently
like the Cathars.
The Cathars, yeah. I mean, apparently the effort was successful. The papal authorities succeeded in making sure that they would never be heard from again. So tell us about the beginning of the Inquisition.
Sure, but do you know that joke about the difference between Jesuits and Dominicans? Jesuits generally tell it about Dominicans, and it has to do with which group was more effective in combating heresy, and the Jesuits were tasked with the job of combating Protestantism, and the Dominicans were tasked with the job of combating Catharism, and the punchline is, have you ever met a Cathar? The Cathars were a flourishing and flourishing in a very accelerated manner group in southern France primarily, but elsewhere in the 12th and 13th centuries, and they were nowadays we'd think they were a kind of new agey group, perhaps on their good days. They believed the physical world was evil, and the spiritual world was the only one worth being part of, and so on. And they also hated the Roman Church. And as this heresy began to take root and get a lot of institutional support from local lords and so on, the church became very concerned. Partly for pastoral reasons, as they would call it, losing souls, and partly for realpolitik reasons, because they were losing authority and power. And it was very hard to get at these people, partly because they had so much protection, and local bishops were often suborned, and they had little alliances with the local secular rulers. So it came about that the popes began creating this new post of inquisitor, and they would send inquisitors out to local communities, and they had the power to question people and convene tribunals and and carry out sentences. And most of the sentences were, fairly mundane, but it ranged from the mundane up to the, very hot indeed.
And the term itself, inquisitor, is pretty benign, right? Notwithstanding the connotations that it has acquired over the years by virtue of what inquisitors actually did, but, they're going to go ask questions, right?
Sure. Interrogation, that word can be fairly benign too.
Right.
And it depends on how it's done.
Yeah.
And, in the case of the Inquisition, theoretically it could be done well. And the Inquisition, to give it credit, and there's been a lot of scholarship, on this topic in the last 50 years or so. The Inquisition did try to set some rules, and it did try to follow them according to its lights. But these things do get out of hand, and it was not unknown for an inquisitor to come someplace and round up an entire village, as an inquisitor did with the village of Montagu, to give a famous example. But inquisitions kind of have no end. That's part of their problem. You start pulling on a thread, and suddenly the whole garment begins to unravel. You don't know where to stop, and you combine that with certain procedures. The person who's being interrogated isn't told where the evidence is coming from. The person who's being interrogated doesn't even necessarily know what the charges are. The person being interrogated doesn't have a lawyer, and then you add in the matter of torture, which could be used in certain cases. So it was not, to put it mildly, it was not a benign process.
No. Although they did have rules, right? I mean, the things you said during torture, I don't know if this rule was applied from the very beginning, but at some point in the history of the successive Inquisitions, it became illegal to use testimony that had emerged during torture against a person, right? They had to repeat it later.
Yes. Now, how much that's a fine point versus a real rule that has teeth is kind of up to you. I know that if I were told that nothing I say under torture can be used against me, but if I'll be asked to repeat it in 24 hours, and if I do repeat it, it will be used against me.
And if you don't repeat it, you will be tortured again.
Yeah. Now, technically, you're not supposed to be tortured again.
You're not. Was that a rule too? That's good.
No. Well, yeah, but wait. So what if some smart cleric, and these were smart clerics. So what if some smart cleric says, you know what, that first session of torture, we only got partly done. So we will have something that we call a continuance. And it's still the same session, so we're still torturing you only once. There are many ways of getting around this.
So there's only one session, but it can last for your entire life.
That's right. It's like The Sopranos. It's a mini series.
Okay, so the brutality we associate with the Inquisition was there from the beginning, and this the first one you refer to as the medieval Inquisition, the one that starts.
Let me give you just a quick
overview
rundown.
Okay.
So the medieval Inquisition begins in around 1230 or so, and it starts up a little bit before then, but it becomes formalized in 1231, and that's focused pretty much on these Christian heretics that we've been talking about. And it goes on for a while, and it crops up in different places. You'll find it in Italy. You'll find it in elsewhere in Europe, and it's actually fairly successful. And you don't hear about the people who were the targets. And that tool is theoretically available to the church, from that moment onwards. But it kind of dies out. So then there comes the Spanish Inquisition, and followed by the Portuguese Inquisition. Now,
that's
these
the,
were little...
the 15th century, late 15th century is the beginning
Yeah,
of the Spanish.
that's in the late 15th century. You know, a good way to keep this in mind is in 1492, a year that we all know for other reasons. That's the year when Spain expels the Jews from Spain, and you know that's an act that's much bound up with the Inquisition, and the Inquisition had started just a decade and a half earlier. And the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions are different from the medieval one in this sense. They're really run by the governments themselves. Technically, the Spanish monarchs had to get permission from the Pope, and the Pope at the time was sort of over a barrel. He needed Spanish help in a lot of ways, and so he basically gave them carte blanche. And the papacy never really had control over the Spanish Inquisition. It was a complete organ of the government. So the Spanish Inquisition starts in the late 15th century, and it goes on until the 19th century. And of course, it gets exported all over the world. Wherever Spain goes, wherever Portugal goes, you get Inquisition.
Including the New World, the Western.
Including the New World, that beautiful plaza in Santa Fe, had Inquisition activity, throughout Latin America, India, Philippines. There was even in Africa, Macau, and so that's another strand. And then in the 16th century, when you have the Protestant Reformation, this is a real challenge, and
apparently,
and so at this point, the papacy itself resurrects the Inquisition idea, and it gives it a real thorough institutional grounding right inside the Vatican itself. It's run by the Vatican. It's highly bureaucratized, and this is the Inquisition that gives you things like the Index of Forbidden Books, which we Catholics were familiar with from our childhood because it designated all the things we thought we wanted to read.
Right.
And so those are basically, simplified, but those are the three main threads of the Inquisition.
Okay. And what makes it the Inquisition in the first place is what exactly? What I mean is, there had long been persecution of heretics, right? But there's something qualitatively different that comes into play at the point where we mark the beginning of the Inquisition.
That's right. Of course, there had been persecution of heretics, for a long time, but it tended not to have enormous staying power. You have to remember that for much of the early Middle Ages and antiquity, there just wasn't an extraordinary amount of communication from place to place. There was a kind of de facto local option. People in this valley believe something. People in that valley, believe something. The papacy itself was not the centralized, powerful institution that it became. So, an awful lot of what we might call low-grade free thinking was going on all the time. And while there was, persecution of this group or that group, it kind of flared and then died out. It wasn't something that was sustained over time. So the reason why, suddenly you're able to have an Inquisition is that for the first time there are tools in place that allow someone who wants to institute a regime of call it discipline and to give it a certain sustainability, has the means to do it. You begin to have, just to give one example, you begin to have a bureaucracy, for instance, and you need to have people and offices in order to do this sort of thing. So that's the real difference between what used to be and what the Inquisition makes possible.
Okay. Now, in the Spanish Inquisition, it really, while reading about it in your book, it just really occurred to me that the Jews and Muslims got a raw deal here, Cullen. I don't know if
they got a terrible deal.
I don't know if that had occurred to you, but I mean, first they say to them, right, you either have to convert or leave, and then if they convert, because the conversion happened under coercion, they are immediately under suspicion of having converted, with less than 100% sincerity, right, and of covertly adhering to their native beliefs.
That's right.
And that's what it was fundamentally about, right? Suspecting people of insincere conversion.
That's right. There was a long history of anti-Semitism in Spain, and it began to get very virulent in the late 14th century. There were pogroms, there were riots, there were thousands of Jews killed, and this was without any Inquisition in existence at all. And as a consequence of that, the so-called solution that the various Spanish regimes put in place. This was before the unification of Spain. Mm-hmm. It was not to say, "Oh, I guess we had better protect the Jews." It was, well, maybe we can make this program go away, make this problem go away by making the Jews convert. And large numbers did convert because it was made clear that the consequences of not doing so were pretty extreme. Nobody knows quite how many, but a large number. But as you say, the Christians harbored this suspicion that the conversions weren't sincere. Mm-hmm. And indeed, you might ask, why would they be? On the other hand, many of them were sincere. This is one of those questions that the historians argue both ways, and there's actually some great scholarship on it of competing viewpoints, but nonetheless, it was an intolerable situation that was created for the Jews, whether they converted or not, because the ones who didn't convert were not in a great position either. Mm-hmm. They were still discriminated against. So the situation in Spain and the level of prejudice and hatred was extreme in Spain.
Yeah, and you make the point that this anti-Semitism at the grassroots level was an essential ingredient of the Inquisition. In other words, it wasn't just that we were seeing an official kind of anti-Semitic stance imposed by authorities, but the day-to-day workings of the Inquisition depended on the enthusiastic cooperation of kind of everyday Christians, right?
Yeah, something certainly had made Spanish Christian society, curdle pathologically, and as I alluded to a few moments ago, that historians don't really have their finger on exactly what caused it, but part of what caused it, for sure, is simply Christian doctrine about Jews and Judaism going way back to the Gospels, as Jim Carroll has pointed out in Constantine's Sword. So there was that doctrinal impetus that lay behind anti-Semitism all along, and there were other factors. There were some economic factors and so on. But the situation in Spain was definitely extreme.
And speaking of doctrine, I've long been interested in how religions can change character, from benign to belligerent, and seem to always be able to find justification in their scripture for whichever attitude they're harboring at the time. And I was interested, however strained an interpretation of Scripture it may take. And I was interested to see in your book that this verse in Luke that some people this account of the marriage banquet in the book of Luke, I think.
Compel them to come in?
Yeah, that came to be used as justification for the Inquisition. And it took, to my mind, such amazing creativity to find in that verse a basis for the Inquisition. But why don't you explain that?
Yes, yeah, no, they were nothing if not creative.
Yeah,
they would do well in certain modern day English departments. So in this case, there's a parable of the wedding feast where certain people don't show up to the wedding in the parable, and the master of the household gets ticked off, and he tells his servants to go out into the highways and byways and get passersby and to bring them in. And the words that he uses are compel them to come in. And so this story, which isn't really about persecution, is actually used by Augustine to begin with, but then by others, as a way of saying, well, you see, look right there. My finger's pointing to the text.
Sure.
It says, compel them to come in.
How could you interpret it otherwise?
That's right. And there's a similar piece of text in the Gospels about separating weeds from the good crops, and burning the weeds, which is justification for burning at the stake. This is called, the technical term is proof texting, and for people in that age, it was the equivalent of the scientific method.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of burning at the stake, Cullen, I was. You have this list of. They actually itemize the cost of the burnings at the stake. And it's just a reminder of how bureaucratic the thing had become. There's like a 7-line, invoice or something. The cost of the large wood, the cost of the vine branches, the straw, the stakes, the ropes to tie the convicts.
That's right.
Of course, one downside of burning at the stake is you can't recycle the ropes. You got to buy new ones every time. The executioner apparently charged 20. I don't know what souls per not SOULS. This is some sort of currency per person burned. So that was a charge of 80 for this particular case. But I guess I had no idea. I don't know. I just never thought clearly about what it takes to institutionalize the burning of people at the stake. But in the Spanish Inquisition. We see the introduction of, I don't know, maybe they still burn people at the stake there too, but there were several distinct methods of torture that were part of the Spanish Inquisition, right?
Yes, and just to answer your implied question, yes, they burned people at the stake.
During the Spanish Inquisition.
Yeah, burning at the stake was the routine method, and occasionally they would. They would show an act of mercy to someone by strangling them before the flames were lit, or by putting a bag of gunpowder around their necks so that before things got too bad, the gunpowder would go off and the person would die. But one way or another, burning at the stake was it. But as to torture, what was your question?
Well, just during the Spanish Inquisition, there were three techniques. There's the famous rack. There's something that consists of kind of people hanging, but then there's a third one with a kind of modern resonance, which was called submarino or something, submarine, and sounds very much like waterboarding.
Well, it is waterboarding, and toca was the name back then, which refers to the cloth that was put in your mouth, and water was dripped on the cloth. And it's exactly the same thing as waterboarding. You may remember a couple of years ago, Christopher Hitchens subjected himself to waterboarding, and what he went through was exactly the same thing that the the Spanish Inquisition used, and there really is no difference at all. It's and the Inquisition knew that it was torture. That's the one difference. They just they had no compunctions about saying that it was torture.
Yeah. Okay. We should give them credit for that. So then the final of the three Inquisitions is the one called the Roman Inquisition. And that, when does that end? That's the one that's about Protestantism, basically. But when does that end?
Yes, well, not really until 1908.
Okay.
But if you want to ask, well, when does the spirit of that end? Then it's a question mark, because the same kinds of activities are, as we were just talking about, are still pursued in a less public manner.
That is the forceful discouraging of holding unacceptable views.
Exactly, but it wasn't just about intellectual matters.
Mm-hmm.
Ordinary people were caught up in the Inquisition. Mostly, it was ordinary people. It's only in our own time when intellectuals really, church discipline has been mainly directed at intellectuals.
Mm-hmm.
They were certainly a target during the Renaissance, but lots of ordinary people were caught up. And there's a famous case in the last days of the Roman Inquisition, which is of Edgardo Mortara, young Jewish boy who was about 5 or 6 years old, and he had a Christian caretaker because she could work on the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
And he had gotten ill quite suddenly, and she, despairing of his soul, had baptized him secretly. And then he got better, and word got around that he'd been baptized, and now what was this baptized boy doing living with his Jewish family? And the Pope took him away.
Mm-hmm.
And this was at a time when the Pope still controlled central Italy, had the power to do that, took him away, brought him to Rome. He eventually became a priest. He preached throughout Europe, primarily to Jews. It was just, an atrocious case. So it was, the Inquisition was still kicking in that sense, well into the 19th century.
Okay. Well, that brings us up to just about to now, and I had said during the later part of the conversation we would talk about the contemporary world. What are some what are some things you see around us now that you think are in some sense the legacy of the Inquisition, or at least are a resurfacing of the impulses or ingredients of the Inquisition?
Let me bring up a couple of them, and just we can talk about them in order. But one of them is, earlier I mentioned some of the tools that are needed to have an Inquisition,
mm-hmm.
and these are the tools that the world, as it becomes modern, begins to develop and then perfect,
mm-hmm.
and then perfect again, and one of those tools is just simply bureaucracy. And we have this notion of bureaucracy as something that is negative, because most of our confrontations, well, see, I've used the word confrontation, but most of our engagements with bureaucracy seem negative
mm-hmm.
to us. But it's actually a positive thing in terms of keeping civilization going, and the bureaucracy that eventually became associated with the Inquisition, while it certainly wasn't perfect and sometimes it was laughable, it was enough to keep an institution going, and sometimes it allowed the institution to keep going even when nobody was really paying attention. You have cases where some person at say at a port in Portugal is given the job checking for contraband, checking for books as they come into the port, and you find that someone at that port does that. That person and their successors do it for a century, and they never find anything, but they keeping records. It's this capacity for something to be set into motion and then a bureaucracy to keep it going forever. That is one characteristic of the Inquisition, and it's a characteristic now. And it's something that I worry about. Just to take the United States, for instance, various police measures. For instance, those connected with the war on terror. Once instituted, do they ever get rolled back? So there's this. It's the capacity of bureaucracy to preserve and extend particular policies in an unthinking way, and that's one. So that's one characteristic of the Inquisition that I see prevalent right now, and prevalent in a worrisome way. And the second one has to do with surveillance. The Inquisition got better and better at surveillance, and it was better in some places than it was in others. In Spain, you had networks of informers. They lived in your town or your village or your neighborhood in your city. In southern France, in the early days of the Inquisition, there were plenty of people to keep watch on their neighbors, and the interrogations, basically encouraged more and more such people to come forward. The techniques of surveillance nowadays, one hardly needs to describe them. They're becoming so immense, and again, combined with certain bureaucratic structures, this is something that ought to be very troubling when you look at the capacities that a Google has or a Facebook. Combine those with other commercial entities, or combine those with the government. The capabilities for surveillance of one sort or another are they're only getting greater.
What do you mean? What do you mean by the phrase you use in the book, the inquisitorial impulse?
Now, by that I mean something different from the tools that I've been talking about. And other tools, just to mention them, would be something like censorship, and another one would be just simply the act of interrogation and how it's done. But leaving those aside, the inquisitorial impulse is it's a mindset in which a person or an institution believes something with a sense of real moral certainty. They believe that they are right about something, right about their view of the world, right about their concept of what is correct and what is wrong, and they feel so strongly about it that they believe everyone should fall into line. And it's easy to see how this is a religious impulse, but I don't think it's hard to see how it's also a secular impulse. At least not after the 20th century, it's not hard to see that. And this is the kind of thinking that Isaiah Berlin, among others, warned against, because it leads you down a terrible path, time and again. There's just if you're possessed of the notion that you are hewing hard to an absolute and ultimate truth, what in heaven's name is ever going to stop you from the course that you've set for yourself and for everybody else?
Yeah, and you say in the book that in your judgment, moral certainty is, I think this is a quote, as pervasive as ever, which, might surprise some people because religious belief, certainly at a kind of elite level among, you might say very well-educated and influential people, is, not as pervasive as it was once. But is your idea that moral certainty of a secular kind has grown in a way that compensates for any decline in faith per se, or what?
Well, I certainly agree with you that institutional religion is not as powerful as it used to be, although I wouldn't discount it. If you look at if you look at American politics, for instance, it's plenty strong, and some of the things that some of its adherents are calling for, having to do, for instance, with banning Sharia law and so on. They do they do seem a little bit Inquisition-like, at least to my eye. But granting your point about religion, moral certainty comes in so many different forms, and perhaps using the word moral gets us off on the wrong track a little bit. But let's just say the word certainty about the way in which society ought to be ordered, and we see a lot of that. For instance, in talking about America in the world, in talking about democracy and how it ought to be exported and the means that can be used to do so. We see it in terms of science, and again, the extent to which science should inform the way we do many kinds of things. We see it bureaucratically in terms of so what's a rational way in which to do to accomplish X, Y, or Z. And all of these things have the capacity to really mow down any opposition. I sometimes think, for instance, when it comes to healthcare, what happens when you have a system in which the information of everybody is available to an organization like an insurer or some other bureaucracy. That organization decides it has a rational approach to how healthcare should be delivered. It can look at everybody's data. It can decide who's behaving, who's not behaving, who deserves this, who deserves that. So that's another form of certainty, and it's not religious and it's not moral, but it is powerful, and it's harnessed to some of these same tools, and it isn't science fiction. You see this happening in little ways already.
And this is kind of a personal question, but is it easy for you to? I mean, you're recommending, I guess, that we all not feel so certain morally. Is it easy for you to reconcile that stance with being a Catholic? I mean, aren't you supposed to be sure of a certain number of things? I think the Pope would like you to be sure of a certain number of things.
Yeah, he and I aren't talking.
Yeah, that's
days.
not working out.
Well, one of the reasons why there was an Inquisition in the first place, I think, is that people thought there was more than one way to be a Catholic, and oops, there was the problem to start with.
And what is your view on that question?
Yes, well, I'm about to tell you. There is a form of Catholicism, and it's probably the form that my ancestors, my pietistic Irish ancestors, subscribed to, which was very devotional, very certain, very hierarchical. But there's another kind that emphasizes different qualities, and one of the great qualities I've always thought was just the quality of doubt. And doubt these days is a very underplayed value in Catholicism, and I think it's an underplayed value in life and in the world. But there is a long tradition in Catholic thought of of doubt as a positive good. The idea of quote unquote doubting well was was an essential underpinning of how do you subject your beliefs or what you think may be your beliefs to a real test, and is it ever wise to hold one thing, one belief too narrowly, too tightly? And this notion of doubt is one that I think has been lost in Catholicism, at least in the leadership of Catholicism. And I wish it would be restored to the central role that it ought to have.
But you don't think Pope Benedict is the man for that job?
I should say I doubt it.
There was this movie by this young Catholic director called Dogma some years ago. Did you see that?
I did not.
Oh, well, it's very much about this. You should. I would not call the movie a work of art, personally. I don't recall his name right now. He's pretty well known. But that was very much the moral of the story. You would resonate to the message, whatever you thought of the movie.
Well, maybe this book will be a chance to do a second movie.
Have you sold the movie rights to this book?
No, but they're available.
I'll bet they are. There's some, you can imagine some compelling footage.
Yes. Yes, I wish Oliver Reed was still alive.
Yeah, I just opened the book at random just to convey how much good material there is in this book for use in other media. I opened up. This is the Mexican Inquisition, and there's some. I think maybe were all these accusations leveled against the same person. You tell me. I'll read some of them. There's a list of actual accusation.
Okay, before you, I know what you're talking about. Before you begin to read them, let me just explain that this is a list of accusations against many different individuals.
Okay.
So one accusation per person.
I was going to say this would seem too tall an order for any single human being, because among the things alleged were claiming sexual intercourse with saints, seeking sexual intercourse with a woman by telling her that God had ordered it, officiating in the marriage of two dogs, and so on, fraud, superstition, and the unlicensed practice of medicine, suspicion of being a Lutheran, naturally bad, asserting that sexual intercourse with him was not a sin. That's a favorite line of mine, I know, and it's never worked. But there you go, right there. I mean, that's a good couple of minutes of amusement in the middle of the movie for comic relief in between torture scenes. So there's one other theme that's very big in the book and relevant to the contemporary world, which is how essential a part of the Inquisition it often was to define a group of people as the other. Right?
Absolutely.
Otherizing is a term that this has become kind of a verb, I think, fairly lately, right? I mean, to otherize.
But not used by me.
Not used by you. Have you heard it, by the way? I like it.
I have heard it.
Yeah, but you don't. You are conservative in the use of language, I know, and you are not yet embracing this.
I'll remain open to the question, but the concept is, it's a great concept.
It is a great concept, and you're seeing a lot of it in American politics, I think. But why don't you talk about its role both in the Inquisition and in the modern world?
Right. One of the reasons that there could be an Inquisition in the first place was because the church began to have a much more developed sense of who quote the other unquote was, and that means who was on the other side of the dividing line, and we were talking not too long ago about how there was a time when there was sort of a local option in terms of what being a Catholic or Christian was, but over time as as the universities and the canon lawyers and the theologians begin to get together, they begin to define much more carefully, what is it that you have to believe to really call yourself Catholic, and what are the subsets of that belief, and when is it that you cross the line, outside of our jurisdiction and into the jurisdiction of some awful place, and this happens, in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, and so it becomes much easier over time to define, who's inside and who's outside, and you begin to have these manuals drawn up that explain, who's a heretic, how do you know? They're a little bit like the, how can you spot a communist manuals from the 1950s, which you and I are barely old enough to remember, and I think I remember a little better than you. And so this notion of otherizing, as you say, is really central. And of course, the Spanish Inquisition, with its conceptions of Jews and Muslims, is a classic example. And so too is the Papal Inquisition, the Roman Inquisition, in the fight against Protestantism. And it's hard not to look around nowadays and just see, the other as almost a permanent fixture of our worldview. It's always part of every person's mindset to some extent. It's just because we are we, and there's always a they out there. But to have it be part of the sort of the hot button, this is a terrible mixed metaphor, template of of the way you order reality is such a prominent feature of things nowadays, both inside this country and then the way collectively we look at people outside the country,
and the way some people look at us.
Sure, this is not the points that I make about the Inquisition are not an American phenomenon and not meant to be. And I write from within the context of the West because I happen to be inside that particular context, but you could find the same lessons if you were in China, for instance. You would find them in Russia. I believe they are worldwide.
And in America, in the book, you mentioned things ranging from the so-called Ground Zero Mosque and the controversy surrounding that to immigration issues, like birthright citizenship. And I guess the thing about this psychological dynamic is that it's always there for politicians to make use of should they choose. And for whatever reason, there are times when they seem to more inclined to make use of it than others. Maybe election years are one time, I don't know, but it does seem there's a fair amount of that around.
The birthright citizenship is one that really took me by surprise, and you can't think about that issue, or at least I can't, without thinking of the idea of blood purity.
Okay, now let's make clear what we're talking about. These are the opponents of birthright citizenship would use the term anchor baby or something, right? I mean, this is about the question of whether any child born in the United States is a citizen, even if born to illegal immigrants?
That's right. The tradition in this country, which I grew up just taking for granted, was, no matter who your parents were, if you were born on American soil, you're an American citizen. That's just the way it has been. And 18 months ago, 2 years ago, this became a really hot issue for a period of time because of what you refer to as anchor babies, which was, the notion that, the absurd notion that illegal aliens were going to come here, have a child, the child would be an American citizen, and then when the child is 21, the child can, take measures to have the parents, legalized. This is real wonderful long-term thinking. I wish most Americans thought in terms of 20 years and 30 years ahead. There is no reality to the anchor baby problem, but the groundswell of support for the notion that we shouldn't have automatic birthright citizenship was a shocker to me. The blood purity that I was referring to earlier was the notion in Spain that you had to be able to show that you didn't have Jewish blood in order to get certain posts and preferments and so on. And this it's a noxious idea, and it carried over many places. The officials in the New World and in New Spain often had to undergo a blood purity test before they could take their offices.
Okay. Let's just talk about one final instance of a reflection in the contemporary world of elements of the Inquisition. And you talk about Guantanamo and extraordinary rendition and torture generally and things like that, right?
Yep.
What do you, when you look at Guantanamo, what in particular strikes you that reminds you of the Inquisition?
Two things. One of them is something that reminds me of the Inquisition in a positive sense because of similarity. And the other is something that reminds me of the Inquisition because of dissimilarity. The similarity is simply the unthinking and bureaucratic nature of the regime. Once put into motion, it's very hard to stop, and it begins on the battlefield. People being swept up in very foggy circumstances. People being denounced for one reason or another, and the coalition troops just taking the denunciations at face value, bringing people into a system of confinement, not levying charges, not saying who denounced, what the source of the charges are, not providing lawyers. The system is not at all dissimilar to the way in which the Inquisition was conducted. And especially as time goes on and the bureaucracy just maintains the status quo, and everyone more or less acquiescing in it. The dissimilar thing has to do with the way torture is regarded by the people who were responsible for putting it into play in the first place. There's if you may remember the famous Bybee memo about torture and how it defined torture.
Is that the one with organ failure? The pain comparable to organ failure as being one of the hallmarks, or
yes, yes, exactly. Torture has to produce pain comparable to that. Torture is something that does irreparable bodily harm, and so think of it this way: the moment something starts to do irreparable bodily harm, in the administration's view, that's when torture begins. The Inquisition's view was torture is occurring all the way up to that point. If it starts to do irreparable bodily harm, it has to stop. And so I just find it amazing to see that dividing line.
So the Inquisitors had a more humane view, you're saying?
I think it's without question. Now, honored in the breach, sure, but just in terms of the theoretical definition, that the point at which the Inquisition says that torture has to stop is the point at which the Bush administration argued torture only begins.
Mm-hmm. Now, they both, as a practical matter, were saying they would stop it then, but during the Inquisition, they acknowledged to themselves that what they had been doing in the meanwhile was torture?
Exactly. Everything up to that point was torture.
Mm-hmm.
And the administration was saying it wouldn't be torture. Nothing up to that point is torture.
Mm-hmm.
It would only be torture if we kept on doing it after that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So, you know, this is, let's be kind of clear on what you're saying about the connection between the Inquisition and these reflections of it in the contemporary world. I don't think you're saying that, you know, had the Inquisition not happened, you know, we would not see hostility toward immigrants or torture. I mean, what I took away kind of is that, you know, we look back at the Inquisition and think of it as this barbaric thing that we've moved beyond and that we now transcend. And yet, if you look at the various things that we find abhorrent about it, I don't think any of them have actually disappeared in a certain sense, you know.
That's exactly right. And then further, if you go back and look at the things that actually made the Inquisition possible in terms of giving it a long-term life, those things are still around too. And in fact, they're only more powerful than they were back then. Things like bureaucracy and technocracy and tools of surveillance and tools of censorship, ways of defining the other versus yourself.
Mm-hmm.
All of this stuff is far more developed now than it was.
Yeah. Okay, well, on that sobering note, I still maintain my view that this is a delightful book about the Inquisition, notwithstanding that grim note. And here's the book. Looks like you've got a nice drawing by a famous illustrator, no?
The great Edward Sorel.
Yes. Familiar to all. So thank you very much, Cullen. This has been great.
Thank you, Bob. I really appreciate the chance to talk to you for such a period.
Yeah. We should do it more often on camera or off.
Yes. I'll look forward to the off period.
I'm available.
All right.
Okay, take care.
Right. Bye, Bob.
Bye-bye.